Hey everyone, Ashley Easter here, and welcome to the Courage Conversation Show. I'm your host. I'm the founder and executive director of Courage 365, and I am so excited to be having an amazing show planned for you tonight with Tasha Hunter. Tasha Hunter is, wow, just a powerhouse woman, and I'm just going to go ahead and read her bio for you. Tasha Hunter is an Air Force veteran with a master's degree in public administration and social work. She is a licensed clinical social worker and resides in North Carolina. She is the author of her memoir, What Children Remember, and hosts the podcast When We Speak. Her private practice, Ascension Growth Center, specializes in treatment of childhood trauma related PTSD. She works to eradicate the stigma of mental health by speaking to others at workshops, seminars about trauma and related mental health topics. Driven and well informed by personal experience, she has a mission to spread awareness about complex trauma and to give survivors a safe space to heal. So after hearing her bio, you know exactly why I invited her on the show. These are all the kinds of things that are important to us here at Courage 365. So without further ado, Tasha, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It is really our honor. And thank you so much for your service as a veteran. We appreciate you. And also as your service as a therapist, because that's like a frontline thing as well, really helping people and saving the world. Yeah, well, thank you again for being on the show. And I just like to just jump right into the questions if that's okay by you.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. So I was looking on your website last night doing a bit of research, and I saw that you have a workshop called Addressing Disruptive Behaviors in School-Age Children, which was really fascinating to me. I love that so much. And I wondered if you could talk about maybe the connection between trauma and disruptive behaviors in children, particularly like what are some of the signs when a child is quote unquote acting out that this might actually be a trauma response?
Sure. So when I worked in the schools as a school-based therapist, oftentimes children would be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD, when in fact there was a trauma component. And so what we most often would see, and this, I worked in elementary, middle, and high schools. So I'll list symptoms that make sense for all of the age spans there, all of the stages of development there. So sometimes that could be refusal to go to school, that could be temper tantrums, that could be incontinence or encopresis or enuresis, and it could be fear, some kind of separation anxiety. It
Mm,
could be skipping school. Really, I'm giving you a full
yeah.
range. Lots of crying, a drop in grades, refusal to do work, um, anger,
Mhm.
fighting. Um, some children refusal to eat. It really there's a personal hygiene, poor personal hygiene, which
Mhm.
is often an issue. Self harm is a really big issue in the schools. I saw it in elementary school, middle school, and high school. Uh, Confusion, memory issues, all kinds of issues that were where they were being treated either disciplined for bad behavior or treated for ADHD, and then further investigation and just assessing, not investigation, but from my end, but assessment on my end revealed that there was a trauma component there.
Mm, wow. Yeah, I have heard that there was, a link, but you just kind of described really, really well in a way I haven't heard before. So thank you for that. And the first thing that just started coming to my mind was like adults do a lot of those things too, you know,
Yeah.
and we're not always there to label them when they don't want to go to work or when they're depressed or when they have low performance on the job. Like it's not as quickly pathologized as when it happens with children. And it makes me wonder if that's because adults are responsible for children and it's easier to label it and medicate it than to get to the root of it. What do you think?
I do think that, and I think that the mislabeling or misdiagnosis is a result of one, the stigmatization of mental health
Mm,
and the lack of trauma informed professionals, whether that is in schools, whether that's in the medical field, and even in our churches and just all areas. We need more trauma informed professionals
mm,
that are able to notice the signs of
yeah,
this is what trauma looks like across, age spans. This is
right.
what it looks like. And so it is often misdiagnosed. So
Mm,
you're exactly right.
mm. Wow, wow. And so, when we're seeing things like that, what what would you say to maybe a parent or caregiver or teacher that has a child who is acting out like that? What would maybe be a first step? And number one, like the first goal is really just to help the child. What sometimes it because it's defiant behavior can make us angry. We could take it personally and feel like, oh, they're being disrespectful. But, how would you recommend a parent, teacher, somebody who is noticing that behavior in a school age child, begin to address that and maybe look deeper? Like, well, what are some steps that they could take for that?
The first thing that comes to mind, Ashley, and you asking that question is, we as adults, we can't be afraid to name it, to ask hard questions.
Yeah.
And thinking of what children experience daily at school and in the home, because trauma can exist, and does exist in a lot of environments that we think are safe. School is
Right.
often the place where children are traumatized. So asking
Mm,
the question, are you being bullied? Is someone forcing you to do things against your will? Is someone touching you or making you touch them, in a
mm,
sexual manner? Are you being verbally or emotionally abused? Yeah, and I can't think about trauma without thinking about our athletes and how much
yes.
trauma happens in extracurricular activities and within the sporting, environment, by coaches who are verbally and emotionally abusive and oftentimes also sexually abusive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So asking the questions, you've got to be courageous enough as an adult, if you're in charge of children or you're a parent, not being afraid to just ask the question, are you okay? Has something happened to you? I'm noticing these changes.
Right. Right. Wow.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm
So,
sorry.
oh no, I'm sorry. And so I think that that really is the first step. And
Mm,
then making sure that a medical visit is incorporated in that, making sure that a mental health visit with a trauma informed therapist or provider is incorporated.
mm. Now, when you say a trauma informed therapist, does that mean
Mhm.
not all therapists are trauma informed?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, how would
Absolutely.
somebody go about making sure that they are?
So when you go on to whether that is therapy for Black girls, Therapy Den, Psychology Today, any one of the directories that are out there,
Hmm.
the Clinicians of Color directory, there's just so many, really filtering it to see who is specialized in trauma. But don't
Yes.
stop there. Look at their websites, look at their training, look at the populations that they serve,
Mm,
and all of that information should be there. They should be telling you, this is what I'm trained in, this is what I went to school for. Um, and then letting that guide your decision. But if they've got everything on their profile checked, they treat every single thing, I would be cautious. And I say that as a therapist and as a woman and therapist who sees a therapist.
right. Right.
So making sure that that person is trained in the whatever your issues are, whatever you're seeking therapy for,
Right.
making sure that you go to someone. So if it's that you're being treated for or need help with an eating disorder or any other an addiction
Mhm.
or sexual assault, that they've got that experience, and asking that question when you are consulting with them.
Right, right. You don't want a jack of all trades. You want somebody
Yeah.
who is specialized in
Mhm.
trauma and in whatever the thing is you're dealing with. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Wow, wow. Yeah, I love that so much. And, as a therapist, could you maybe share some of the differences
Mhm.
between the effects of trauma and abuse on a child versus an adult? Like, how does early trauma impact a child's development? Because I know personally, I've had traumatic experiences as a child and they've hit different than when I've had some traumatic experiences as an adult. And, I wonder if you could just kind of talk about some of those differences and why it's that way for our audience.
Sure. So in children, I'll just kind of list some of the symptoms for each. Some of the symptoms that you might see in children, and I mentioned some of them earlier, but there may be increased fear, startle response, appetite changes. You might even see like isolation. Children may complain of body pain that's really unexplainable but new, um, or headaches or stomach aches. You may see changes in their sleep where they used to sleep fine, and all of a sudden they're either not sleeping at night or they're having nightmares.
Yeah.
Memory loss is very common. Again, in looking at the different ages, uh, self-harm happens
Mm,
a lot, and pulling out hair, cutting, burning themselves, hitting themselves is very common. Um, and then towards the middle school, high school, hypersexuality. So acting out sexually, but
mm,
then what that looks like in an elementary school child, that may just be them kind of acting out sexually, kind of modeling adult type behavior.
right, right.
Um, and then when it comes to adults, honestly, some of those same symptoms,
Mm,
but in adults, it's chronic medical conditions.
mm,
So if you have someone who comes in and they've got diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, they're obese, and they've just got a lot, maybe even chronic pain, those invisible illnesses,
yeah.
hypervigilance, again, sleep issues and nightmares, right?
Mm,
Issues in relationships, addictions, disordered eating, intrusive thoughts. There's so many symptoms, and a lot of it, again, it's some of the same things that you see in children, but oftentimes with adults, they're diagnosed with depression and anxiety, which they may have,
mhm,
but they're not assessed for PTSD.
mm, yeah, yeah.
Um, and so looking at all of that from a medical perspective, if someone is coming in and they've got all of these chronic health conditions, um, and you also notice also a generational component, asking about trauma within their family, asking about personal experiences with trauma, and
Mm,
then connecting them with a therapist.
mm,
Children, unfortunately, don't have the language. They're not supposed to have the language because they're children and their little
yeah,
brains,
yeah.
haven't developed yet.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing the behaviors, but again, not asking the questions. Again, the stigmatization of mental health, the lack of information in families,
Mm,
and then the lack of awareness in terms of what is trauma.
yeah.
A trauma could be a child that grows up in an extremely strict environment. Trauma for a child could be that this child has had to move homes a lot and hasn't
Mm,
ever been able to acclimate to one individual neighborhood or home or community. Or trauma could be the more severe,
mm,
that they've experienced grief, that they've experienced abuse or abandonment. Any number of things
right,
could
right,
be an event that causes trauma. So I
right.
hope I answered that, for you.
Yeah. No, that's helpful, and I think it's also helpful that you said, there's a wide variety of things that can cause
Mhm.
PTSD. And so while on this show we often talk about abuse and sexual abuse, there's other things that can be traumatic.
Mhm.
Like you said, moving, or, having a really strict household that maybe doesn't necessarily fit some of the traditional um, descriptions of abuse, but could just be very stifling. So I think that's really helpful to know that there's a lot of things that could be causing it, and maybe even a little comforting to parents that if their child is displaying some of these symptoms, it's important to probe and ask questions, around, could there be some dangerous situations going on? But there could also be other just environmental things that are causing the behavioral, you know, uh, acting out and stuff. And then also I think it's what I saw as a child and what I see a lot of times now is that children aren't often treated like people. They're treated
Yes.
like things or pets. Um, that are there for the purpose of making the adults look good. And so when you're describing some of the symptoms in children, and then some of the same symptoms in adults, which we more confidently label and are like, oh, okay, well, I have empathy for you, but we often don't extend that same empathy to children because, I mean, I know a lot of adults that'll throw a temper tantrum now and
Yeah.
again, and people are like,
Yeah.
oh, they're just having a bad day, get some chocolate, have some wine. But when a child has it, it's automatically like, this is disrespectful, this is disruptive, this is, ruining my day, and just realizing like, no, we're all humans, and these are natural responses to trauma, PTSD, stressful environments. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I love what you said. Oftentimes with children, they're they're kind of like property.
Yeah.
Well, you're my child, so that equals you're my property,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to act and believe and do the things that I want you to do, and anything outside of that is disrespectful. And then it's you know treated as okay. There's some punitive action associated to it, or some abusive action,
Right. Right.
and oftentimes actually in a lot of families that aren't articulating that what they are reinforcing is trauma, what they're practicing is abusive
Mm-hmm.
behavior.
Right.
It's that, well, this is how it's always been in our family. This is what we do.
Right.
And part of the thing that I do is providing some context, some education around that.
Mm.
And if we're looking at it from a biblical perspective, let's say discipline and spare the rod, spoil the child. Well, did the book of Proverbs really, did that scripture really mean you're literally beating your child with a rod?
Exactly.
Like a little bit of common sense. and
Right, right.
and so oftentimes parents use that example as it's okay to beat my children.
Yeah.
And from a black woman's perspective, I'll look at generationally, historically, ancestrally, that scripture of, that it's okay to beat a person because you're trying to get them to submit, you're trying to discipline them, you're trying to train them.
Mm,
And so, from a historical lens, if that was done to my people to break us down, why would I want to do that to someone that I love, to my
right,
child?
right.
That makes any sense.
It does. No, that makes so much sense. And I think you're right. Like there's a lot of quote unquote biblical justification. I've really been encouraged by the gentle parenting movement and a lot
Mhm.
of their I wouldn't even call it reinterpreting, but maybe proper interpreting scriptures like that, where it's like, okay, the rod was like actually a symbol of leadership and direction. It wasn't for beating. Um, like, was that even the context of that verse? And have we just read into it what is most convenient to us because that makes instant submission, even though it's not, you know.
Yeah,
Anyway, there's a lot of studies on how beating
yeah.
children does not help in the long run and does not accomplish the goals of the parent in the long run, as well as adds much trauma to the child. So But I digress. I think you and I are
Yeah.
both on the same page there.
Yes, very much.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well that's helpful. Um, so a question that I've got for you is, many of the survivors in our audience are adult survivors of child abuse. So, they experienced it in the past, they're now adults. Maybe it was abuse, maybe it was neglect. And as a therapist, like, what are some of your favorite tips for somebody to step forward towards healing and empowerment? I mean, obviously, therapy is a big thing, and feel free to talk about that. But if there's any like tips that you have of like, this happened in the past, I'm here now, but I'm still, having the effects of what happened to me as a child.
Yeah, in terms of tips, you just said it. My first tip is to be able to name your experiences. If that takes you journaling, about your experience, if that's talking to a trusted friend or someone that is a safe place for you,
Mm,
somebody that knows how to hold compassionate space for you, then naming the abuse or the trauma with that person, and also get therapy from a trauma informed therapist. I cannot state that enough. Like, get
mm,
therapy, and also get other forms of support, because we don't want to kind of, sometimes if we have one person that we trust, we can wear them out talking
mm.
about all of the things that happen to us. So that's why a professional is really important. But also having support within your community or even online space can be a huge form of support.
Right.
And what does that look like? That is potentially joining a 12-step group
Mm,
for adult children of alcoholics or adult children of dysfunctional families.
mm.
um, Joining a support group for adults who have experienced sexual abuse or
Yeah.
sexual assault. There's all kinds of support groups for codependency, for um, just all kinds of issues. And so, if you need help, there's resources online. Google your need, and is there a 12-step group available for the thing that I am experiencing right now,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
speaking to others. And so, and what comes to mind for me is like there's groups for like Overeaters Anonymous, where you may be going because of disordered eating, but in that space you find out, oh, we all experience, or a good number of also experience some form of trauma.
Right.
And so being able to connect with people just like you in a safe environment. I also recommend that if this is something that you're dealing with, reading all the books, read all the things you can about how to heal, how to create healthy boundaries, how to have healthy relationships,
Yeah.
books that define PTSD and the treatment of it. Read memoirs of people that have experienced, the type of trauma that you experienced,
Right.
and get inspiration and encouragement that way. So lots and lots of tips, but I think it starts with naming it and then getting support.
Yes. I affirm all those things. And I know for me, just naming some of the experiences, on one hand, it added a level of seriousness to it that was like, whoa, but even in that was like a validation of how I was feeling. But also in naming it, there was kind of this weight lifted off of like, I always felt like something was wrong in this situation. And I just couldn't articulate how to call it in the moment. And so, yeah, naming is so important. And then sharing with somebody that's safe. I personally, I have a therapist. I'm scheduled to see her, I think next week. And,
Mhm.
I've been on this
Yeah,
healing journey for several years, but therapy is amazing. Like, I feel like it's like the
yeah,
dentist, but you should go more often than the dentist.
yeah,
Everybody needs a tooth
absolutely.
cleaning, but
Hmm. Hmm.
probably more often than every six
Yeah.
months. Yeah, yeah. Okay, those are really super helpful tips. Thank you for that.
Hmm.
Um, and then many of the survivors I've talked to, they've mentioned like the social stigma about mental health and therapy, that kind of thing. And some of our people in our community have grown up in churches and faith communities where it was like, oh, therapy is evil, it's dangerous, you should just pray it away or talk to a church counselor instead of a, actual trained therapist. Then there's cultures who have, whole people groups who have been really traumatized by misuse of therapy and experimenting. And so there's fear around that. And we have some people in our community that have, dealt with that either themselves or in their family history. And so, you know, what words of wisdom would you have for people who either have like a cultural stigma based on like just society saying therapy is something to be ashamed of, or even people that have been historically not treated well by therapy? Like what would you say to people experiencing those things and those fears?
First, validating, because there is a lot of fear in speaking to someone that you don't know and someone that may not look like you, may not believe the way that you believe. There is fear in that, and it makes sense. And so I absolutely understand that. Therapy, it can be scary, you know, especially if you have grown up in an environment where you've been told, don't trust other people, or what goes on in this house stays in this house, um, or any number of things, or you don't need to go to therapy. All you need to do is go to God with it, and Jesus is the ultimate counselor. All of these really harmful and idiotic statements.
Yes.
I know that I heard, uh, but when you grow up in a culture such as that, it makes help seeking very difficult. And so my heart goes out to anybody that's still kind of in that type of mind frame, or that grew
Mm,
up with that. I get it. Also, let me just validate also the fact that historically, if I'm looking at it from, again, a Black woman's perspective, and in the BIPOC community, people of color, therapy, mental health, that whole system was not created for us.
right.
So it was something very much to be afraid of. We could not speak to people outside of our homes about the things that were going on, because oftentimes those people didn't even support or want us in their offices, right?
Yeah.
And that could mean loss of benefits. That could mean breaking up our families. That could mean any number of things that created environments or situations that were just totally unsafe or
Mm,
detrimental to us. And so, looking at a cultural lens, that is important. So we couldn't talk to people about the trauma that we experienced in our communities, racial trauma, transphobia, homophobia. We also could not go to anyone outside of our homes if we were experiencing traumatic events in our own home, sexual abuse,
yeah.
physical abuse, parental abandonment, or any number of things. And so now, here's the thing: you can look online, and for any number of things that you, no matter who you are, whatever your cultural background, there is a therapist that you can go to that will match your your faith perspective, whatever that is. And if you don't have a faith perspective, there are, clinicians that you can see. You can see someone based off of their race, their gender, their sexuality, whether they are allies with you. There's so many options. Go in person, go online, have therapy over the phone, have therapy in writing, walk and talk therapy. I mean, just so many options out there. And it's going to take trying it out. And also, lastly, Ashley, on that, because I don't know if I'm veering off course or not, but
No, this is good.
but also, as I stated before, churches are not always safe places, and they are very
Yeah.
much. It's been my experience and the experience of many of my clients that church is the place where the majority of their trauma occurs.
True. Yeah.
So just because someone has a label of pastor, reverend, leader, minister, does not mean that they are a safe person.
Right.
They could, in fact, be the abuser.
Yeah.
So seeking help outside of church walls, or spiritual, environment, seeking help outside of that
Hmm.
is really, really important. Unless that person is, again, trauma informed
Hmm.
and trained, and they have the credentials to prove it,
Yeah.
and the character, the reputation to prove that they are a safe person. that
Uh,
makes any sense.
yes, I agree 100% with that.
Mhm.
And I love that you said the credentials to prove it. And I would even say, I'm particularly skeptical of pastors and spiritual leaders. So I would even like take a close look at those credentials because sometimes it'll
Mhm.
be from like, the Biblical Counseling Association,
Yes,
which is not therapy. This is
yes.
nouthetic counseling and it's very damaging. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Mhm.
echo everything that you said about being wary of people who don't actually know what they're doing. I think about it in terms of like if you have a severed arm and you're like your arm is like bleeding off, you don't call a pastor and be like, "Will you pray for me?" If you call a pastor, the pastor's job should be like, "Let's call 911 and get someone to take care of that arm that is severed and bleeding." And
Mhm.
when churches instead are like, "Oh, we'll pray over it, we'll anoint it with oil," or like, no,
Mhm.
no, that's
Yeah,
that is outside of their job description, and
yeah,
pastors who don't realize that are really doing a lot of harm. They need to refer people to professionals.
yeah,
Whew, yes, I I
yeah,
get a little fiery about that one.
yeah.
Yes.
And Ashley, I'll add to that. It isn't just harmful; it's detrimental to people.
Yes.
And if we're speaking in medical terms, in my previous career, we would give statistics and do training on hospital acquired infections.
Mm.
But in churches, we don't often talk about church acquired infections
Ooh, yes.
and the deaths and the harm that is being done where people come in. And I've heard pastors and preachers and leaders say that church is like a hospital for the sinner. Well, if it's a hospital, I should never leave worse than when I came in.
Yes.
I should never feel like I'm not enough. I should
Mm,
never feel like I should feel ashamed of my history, of my current lifestyle, of anything. And I should definitely never feel like I'm not wanted or loved or accepted for just who I am.
right.
And so oftentimes when we think about suicide rates, when we think about addiction and all of these different things, there are real implications for what's being done, the trauma that's being done in these religious and spiritual environments.
Mm,
People are literally dying because of the trauma that they experienced in these again in these environments. And so we do need to look at that, and it's not being discussed enough.
mm. Yeah. No, that's so important. Yes, 100%. Whew, get me riled up. I agree with all of that so, so much. So I know people, who are tuning in are listening and
Yeah.
they're like, wow, how do I get to know Tasha more? Like, tell us about where your work is. Like, are you taking clients and like, tell us all the things where people can follow you because I think some other people are going to be fired up too after hearing what you said.
Sure, I have some limited spots available.
Mhm.
I only treat adults with a history of childhood trauma. That's my sweet spot, and that's what I'm in this world to do. And so I have limited spots available for that. My practice is called Ascension Growth Center. My website is ascensiongrowthcenter.com, but I'm also an author. I wrote a book about my own trauma called What Children Remember. And if anybody wants to know anything that I'm doing in the therapy space, book space, podcast space, I've got a podcast called When We Speak that's available
Yes.
on all platforms. Um, and so if anybody's like, well, who is this Tasha girl? What is she up to? Where can I find her? Go to Instagram, you guys. That's the only social media that I use. And my handle is Tasha Hunter LCSW.
Perfect. Yes, everybody go check that out. We're going to have those links below so you can definitely just easily click over there. Follow Tasha. She's amazing. I'm going to be on her podcast coming up pretty soon, which I'm excited about. So, yeah, stay tuned because we're doing another collaboration.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This is really valuable information. You really hit the nail on the head. And so, thank you so, so much. Really, really appreciate it.
This has been awesome. Thank you, Ashley.
Absolutely. Hey, and everybody who's tuning in, you can also follow Courage 365 social media, and you can do that by finding us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and we're also on Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and share it with your friends on your social media and tag us. We would love, love, love for you to do that because I know and you know that this information was good and that there are people in your friends list that could really benefit from hearing it. So go ahead and give this a share. Then pop on over to our website, which is courage365.org. And just for going to the website, we are offering you a free gift, which is our ebook, 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage, to help you take your next most courageous steps in your survivor healing journey. And if you are in any kind of imminent danger, any type of imminent danger, if you know or suspect child abuse, please contact the authorities. But for other things, you can go to our website, courage365.org/need help. Click the Need Help tab. And we have a huge list of different resources that you can sort through, different links, hotlines, all the things, so you can get the support that you need. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. Live with courage. See you next